So we are picking up chapter 4 after the first exam. So this is the first material that's going to be on the second exam. There's the hours that I should be available in the lab. They're not letting people on campus on Friday, so the Friday's been blacked out. I think that one you can read. Change is spectacular on a molecular level. Doesn't look like much in the bottle. So we got the bits and pieces of the atoms all done. Now we're going to talk about how atoms fit together into molecules. Molecules are at least two atoms stuck together. Even if they're the same type of atom, the oxygen around us in the air that we breathe is O2. Two oxygen atoms stuck to one another because they're more stable that way than as radicals unbonded to anything. But oxygen will stick to lots and lots of different things. That's why we talked about how reactive it is. There's a few different types of bonds. Molecular formulas tell you what atoms, what elements are in the molecule, and in every molecule, how many atoms of that are in it. They do get more complicated than this. Sometimes there are pieces that are stuck on that wind up in parentheses, but not for this class. If you're doing more advanced chemistry, the formulas get more weird. But you know, H2O, two hydrogens and an oxygen, CO2, one carbon and two oxygens, CO, carbon monoxide, carbon and one oxygen, and glucose, C6H12O6. You're gonna be tired of hearing about glucose. There's three different types of bonds that have some impact on living things. The first one is when two ions of different charges stick to one another, like two ends, opposite ends of a magnet stick to one another. When you look this up online, it makes it look like it only happens in nature when the two radicals get near each other and trade electrons. So the electron goes over to one that needs one for its outer, sometimes more than one, for its outer shell, and gives, it winds up with a negative charge, the one that gave up the electrons, because it no longer has the balanced protons, has a positive charge. In the real world, ions are way more stable than radicals, and so the ions is the form that things are in. So salt, sodium chloride, Na plus connected to Cl minus. The only way they're trading electrons is if you're whipping them up in a lab. But in the real world, just like inside us, we have all sorts of sodium in us, but it's sodium ions. We have all sorts of chlorine in us, but it's chloride ions. And when they stick together very tightly like two ends of a magnet, except they don't tend to stay together in water. We'll talk about that when we talk about water. So ionic bonds are good. The materials tend to be very stable, salt crystals, think of, but they don't tend to stay together in water. So we get sodium from salt, we get chloride from salt. You've actually never tasted salt because all you're reacting to is the sodium ions. As soon as it hits the wetness of your tongue, it comes apart. So these things don't much exist in living things. You can make a case for the calcium carbonate in your bones being ionically bonded, but you don't see it a lot. where the bonds stay stable. The other two bonds are what you actually find in molecules in living things. H2O. Why is there two hydrogens? Oxygen is in column 6. It has 6 electrons in a shell that should hold 8, and to get stable, it needs 2 electrons. Hydrogen is in column 1, but it's a little bitty thing. It has 1 electron in a shell that should hold 2. To be stable, it should have 2 out there. So what it does is hydrogen shares 1 of its electrons with the oxygen and gets 1 from the oxygen back. That puts the hydrogen up to the stable number of 2. It puts oxygen to the not quite stable number of 7. Needs another hydrogen. So another hydrogen shares out an electron with the oxygen. The 2 electrons together bring the 6 in the shell up to 8. Oxygen shares an electron out to this hydrogen and bring it up to 2, to that hydrogen and bring it up to 2. And the way they sit with one another kind of pushes the hydrogens off to the side a bit. When we look at water molecules, you'll see that. And that's what's happening here. Covalent bonds are sharing. They're sharing an electron or 2 out. They're sharing an electron in. These bonds can be multiple bonds. There's carbon dioxide. There's water. There's the O2, the oxygen that's in the atmosphere. And it's a double bond. Each oxygen is sharing 2 electrons with the other one. Remember column 6, they need 2. They share 2 out, they get 2 back. It's a double bond. Holds them together a little bit more tightly. They're more stable that way than if they're just floating around looking to get electrons. The nitrogen that's in the air around us, column 5, sticks together with a triple bond. So about 3/4 of the air you're breathing right now is nitrogen molecules, N2, stuck together with triple bonds. That holds them together really, really tightly. It's hard to get them apart. Turns out nitrogen is essential in certain molecules for living things like proteins, like DNA, but it's not that easy to use the nitrogen out of the air because it's stuck together so tightly. There's only a few living things that can pull the nitrogen out of the air, fiddle with it, and use it to make things like proteins and DNA. And we all kind of depend on the funguses and the bacteria that can do that. But we can't. That's one of the reasons why there's so much nitrogen in the air. It's not that easy to use. But double bonds, triple bonds, you don't really get quadruple bonds. Theoretically, in column 4, you potentially, there's 4 bonds available there, but you don't really get, it pulls all the electrons over to in between. It doesn't really work well. Pictures. Oops. Remember this? Columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, representing the electrons in the outer shell, where the smallest shell holds 2. 1, 2. The next shell down holds 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The next shell holds 8, and then it starts to get weird. As the atoms get really big, the shells start to subdivide, and you get repetitions and all sorts of things. We're not worried about that, not chemistry. We're not worried about that. But you're gonna get, these form natural ions, positive ions. They dump those electrons off because they only got 1 or 2. These tend to form negative ions. They're close to being full, so they'll snatch electrons from other places. The ones in the middle, oops, The ones in the middle here tend to not be able to dump theirs off or grab enough to fill themselves up, so they tend to share. Oops. This is that picture I told you doesn't really represent reality, where the sodium gives an electron over the chlorine, and now it's got an extra electron and is now negative, and this one's lost an electron. Its protons are no longer balanced in there, and it's a positive. This is really, this is really the way things exist in the world. And they stick together. They're salt crystals. Now, the elements that are in living things are mostly 4 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Now, this is misleading because it's representing how much of this there is by weight. If you did this by number of atoms compared to the number of atoms in the other ones, almost this whole circle would be hydrogen, because there's hydrogen on everything. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of hydrogen atoms on most what they call organic molecules. So rather than give a pie chart that's like all gray, they've divided this up by weight. And this is the heaviest of the elements, this is the next heaviest element, this is the next heaviest element, this is the latest element. So not a heck of a lot of nitrogen, and then there's other stuff as well. This brings us to HONC. This is the best way to remember, HONC, H-O-N-C. Hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon. Hydrogen, column 1 electron in there, it needs 1 to get to 2. It forms single bonds, 1 bond. Oxygen has 6, needs 2, forms 2 bonds. Nitrogen has 5, needs 3 bonds. Carbon has 4, needs 4. So H-O-N-C, 1 available bond, 2, 3, 4. And so if you have an organic molecule, if you got a carbon, there's 4 different ways it can bond around it, sharing electrons. That makes carbon great as a hub. It can hold a lot of molecules together, because it's like, I got 2 atoms here and 2 atoms here. Nitrogen, an okay hub. I got 1 atom here and 2 atoms here. Can hold 3. Oxygen it can hold 2. It's a bridge. And hydrogen is a capper. It tends to be all around the outside of molecules, stuck on the outside. Wherever there's a single bond available, you got hydrogen out there. So this brings us to, as I mentioned, now in previous semesters, I would always ask a question. I would draw a molecule, leave all the positions blank, and you would have to fill out, which of these it was, just by counting the bonds. So wherever there were 3 bonds, it would be a nitrogen. Wherever there was 2 bonds, there'd be oxygen. Even if there was a double bond, that's 2 bonds. That would be oxygen. I don't know that I can do that with this remote stuff, so you may or may not get something like that if I can figure out how to do it. The third type of bond is a weird kind of bond. The more positive the inside of an atom, the more strongly it can actually hang on to the negative electrons going around it. So if you've got sharing between 2 atoms and one of them's got more positives than the other one, it's going to hang on to the electrons a little bit more than the weaker one. The one with fewer positives can't hold on to the electrons that well. Well, hydrogen, one lonely proton, not going to hold on to its shared electron very well. So if you've got, say, water, hydrogen and oxygen, and you look to find the electrons are mostly going around the oxygen because it's got more of a pull to it. It's got more positives in its nucleus. And the electrons are spending less time around the hydrogen, which means its proton isn't really balanced out by the electrons going around it. This gives you a charge distribution that is more negative at the bigger, grabbier atom and more positive at the smaller, weaker element, atom. That's what hydrogen's bonds are. In a big molecule, you'll have some areas that'll be slightly positive, some areas that will be slightly negative, and they tend to be sticky for one another. They're attracted to each other. But how strong that attraction is has a lot to do with how partial the charges are. So in some cases, the hydrogen bonds can be pretty strong, hold things like a protein together, gives DNA that weird curlicue formation that DNA has. But in some molecules, the partial bonds are pretty weak, and so they come apart pretty easily. The protein in egg white is held together by hydrogen bonds, but not all that tightly. And so if you get it shaken, you heat it up, it tends to go from a nice round molecule to being kind of bleh, and it starts to catch on all the other ones. And you go from having this slimy, transparent egg white to this plasticky white egg white where the proteins have what they call denatured. They changed their shape. They haven't come apart, but they've changed their shape in a way where they're hooking onto one another and forming that cooked egg white. And some proteins are very, very stable. They've got either covalent bonds holding them together in bridges or hydrogen bonds that are pretty strong holding them together. Some of them are pretty weak. Okay, that brings us to the next thing is going to be about water, which is very much all about the hydrogen bonds.